Hello, everyone. We are thrilled to be here today. Lauren, we have a lot to talk about.
We have a lot to talk about.
Well, we're just going to dive right in, everybody, and we're going to start to talk about a gas, methane specifically.
Right. Yes.
And Lauren recently started Overview Capital. And so I'd love for her to launch us off today by telling us a little bit about why you launched Overview Capital, specifically focused on mitigating methane emission reductions.
Sure. It was a really interesting journey to get here. My background is in environmental science, and I've worn many hats under that umbrella. I worked on EV policy, I worked on capital infrastructure projects like wastewater treatment plants, and I also worked in waste through roles that I had under a platform that I built called Trash is for Tossers and a company that I scaled called Package Free. And I had been dedicating 2 decades of my career mostly to climate, and at the end of the pandemic, I took a step back and looked at kind of the impact of what my career has done and realized that despite my best efforts to solve the climate crisis is worse now than when I started. And I started to ask why. We've deployed billions, if not trillions of dollars into climate change mitigation, but we don't have the ability to realize measurable change. Why is that? So I started looking at things like atmospheric concentrations of gases, and I started looking at where capital flows have gone, and realized that over long periods of time, not to get too science heavy.
We can get science heavy.
over long periods of time, carbon dioxide is the primary driver of climate change, making up approximately 80% of overall of the gases that are driving climate change over a 100-year time frame. And that's why we've allocated the majority of climate capital, over 96%, to decarbonization. However, we've kind of missed the forest through the trees in doing this, and by taking a centuries-long approach to climate change, we haven't fully appreciated the drivers that are causing climate change in the short term. So over a 20-year time frame, actually carbon dioxide makes up under 50% of all of the warming that we're currently realizing, and the other warming is driven by things called superpollutants, things like methane, tropospheric ozone, nitrous oxide. And when I followed the capital, I realized even though methane is responsible for 1/3 of current warming, it's received under 2% of all climate financing. And so I decided to launch a fund called Overview Capital with the sole focus of investing in these underappreciated sectors in the superpollutant space.
I really appreciate many of the things you just brought up, and for those folks learning with us today, I think one is really thinking about the time scale that different gases play in the atmosphere, right? And so one of the things we talk about at Project Drawdown is how time is often more important than tech, right? And I think that's especially critical when we think about gases like methane, right? So I think we've established why we should care about methane, right? Methane is a super pollutant. It is extremely potent, an extremely potent heat-trapping greenhouse gas, and it's underfunded. Yeah. And so for the people interested in this work, we'd encourage them to step into this space. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about, as you think about your fund, how are you leaning into science? Like, how is science informing your work at Overview Capital?
It's a great question. So a lot of the methane mitigation technologies are quite new. So this is a very nascent space. And we are seeing a really interesting moment where policy action is preceding capital investment into methane mitigation. You have things like the waste emissions charge, which is actually creating a fee and fine structure for excess methane emissions in the oil and gas industry. You're seeing fines and penalties in places like Denmark and coming up in California for the excess emission of methane from bovines or cows. You are seeing things like Bovaer, which is a methane suppressant in cows, being FDA approved way before it's actually scaled from a commercial use perspective, or pilots have really gone anywhere. And so it's really interesting to see that the capital hasn't met the tailwinds that are approaching the methane space. And so just to kind of take a step back and talk about what we focus on at Overview Capital, we focus on technologies and companies that are incredibly science-driven, that have the capacity to take the largest bite out of methane in the shortest amount of time possible. And right now, we're looking at two main sectors because of the policy and regulatory tailwinds that I mentioned. The first one is agriculture, specifically ruminant animals or things like bovines, which are responsible for about 30% of all anthropogenic methane emissions, or 10% of current global emissions. And so by addressing those emissions, we're investing in things like feed additives and vaccines that actually suppress the methanogens that cause methane emissions from cows. The second largest sector and an emitter of anthropogenic methane is the oil and gas industry, specifically natural gas. Methane is the primary component of natural gas. And so we're investing in technologies that help to detect emissions, help to mitigate emissions, and help to provide pathways to emissions reductions for oil and gas operators. And I think in that regard, it's important to note, and ask, why haven't we focused on this more before? And the main reason is that methane has been historically underestimated. For something like the oil and gas industry, the methane emissions reports are pretty much 100% estimates and 0% actual. So we've not actually been able to measure this gas and then report how much is actually being emitted from these practices. And because of things like the proliferation of satellite technology through GHGSat or MethaneSat or Carbon Mapper, we have actual emissions reports. And what we're seeing is that these emissions are significantly higher than we thought before. So we assume a third of all warming, but actually it can be much, much, much higher as we realize and start to process this data from satellites and more measurement technologies.
One of the things that you've done this week to really take advantage of folks who are here for New York Climate Week is you brought together 200 folks for a methane intensive.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about the kinds of folks who were in the room and maybe some of the themes that emerge when you get 200 people in a room talking about methane?
Sure. So it was a 4-hour converging of people across many different sectors talking pretty much ceaselessly about methane. So it was a long day, and what was so exciting about it was that we approached things in kind of a chronological way, meaning we started by talking about the science of methane, how we just approached it, talking about why it's so important, what actually causes methane to be so much more potent than carbon dioxide. And then we started talking about things like measurement, right? As I mentioned, if you don't measure methane, we're estimating it, we're badly underestimating it, and then it's hard to regulate, it's hard to build markets around it. So what are the tools needed to measure methane? And then from there, we started talking about capital pathways. So are there capacities for people to make money from methane mitigation? And who is investing in methane mitigation? Is it large corporates? Is it venture capitalists like myself? And then we started going into regulatory and policy actions, and then finally we ended on technologies and innovations in the space that are actually going to commercialize quickly that can reduce these emissions significantly. And in the room we had executives from organizations like Waste Management, ExxonMobil, Riverstone, a global energy company, and then we had technologists, we had not-for-profits. It was really a mashup of so many different people, and the reason that's so important is because this is not a one-person or a one-sector solution. There are main drivers of anthropogenic methane, but we all need to come together because actually a lot of the tools to quantify and mitigate methane emissions can be utilized across all of its emitting sources.
First of all, that sounds amazing. Thank you for...
It was very fun.
Yeah, thanks for convening folks. We also, just a space where people can have a focus on methane. There's some themes that I'm already picking up on from our conversation. One being to talk about methane, that it isn't talked about enough. It
really
isn't part of climate conversations, right? Another is to think really about measurement, right? How do we talk about it? How do we measure it? And then find different pathways to invest in it. And I love that that's what Overview Capital is really doing. I'd love to know a little bit more about your investment strategy.
Sure.
There's all sorts of capital pathways, all different kinds of capital that work at different stages of development for different technologies and innovations. Where are you in that space, and how do you, what's your strategy for investing?
So we like to think of ourselves as not being a traditional venture fund in the sense that we're trying to really support market creation here. This is a very nascent space, and so a big part of our job is to converge people and have discussions about why this is so important, help to push our friends at other funds and later stage funds to invest capital into the space. So as I mentioned, methane is 30% of current warming, but has received under 2% of all climate capital, so there's a huge opportunity to invest here, and it is quite literally the best lever that we have to reduce warming within our lifetime. And if we don't address methane, or if we wait a day or a week or months to address methane, it has incredibly detrimental consequences for our climactic future go forward. We have the capacity to reduce about 0.5 degree of warming by 2100 if we start to reduce methane emissions today. But every day we wait is a day too late, because methane is a short-lived climate pollutant. It only lives in the atmosphere for approximately 12 years, but in those 12 years, it's 84 times more powerful of a warming driver than carbon dioxide. And so, we as a fund, and how we approach all of this is we are investing in early stage technologies that are right at the moment of their inflection point to scale and have commercial adoption, helping to get them to the point where they can, as I mentioned, take these very large bites out of the methane problem very, very quickly. And I get incredibly frustrated, being here at Climate Week and hearing most of the conversation being centered around carbon dioxide still. And while we need to focus on carbon dioxide and we need significantly more capital and energy, reducing carbon today won't affect our climate reality today. Carbon lives in the atmosphere for upwards of 300 plus years, and so reducing it helps our children's children's children, but it doesn't really change our experience and how we're living and our temperatures today. So we have to address methane. We have to focus on methane. It is underappreciated significantly, and if there's anything that I feel my role is, whether it's at my fund or having conversations like this, is to scream from the rooftops that we have to focus more on methane in every single capacity, whether it's from an investment perspective, a technological perspective, or a regulatory perspective.
I'm just going to underscore that one more time, the critical importance of methane. And at Project Drawdown, we talk about methane as an emergency brake, right? One of the solutions, one of the areas that we need to focus on as quickly, safely, and equitably as possible. So we talk about methane, we talk about stopping tropical deforestation, we talk about food loss and waste, some of the things that if you deal with them today, right, because they're short-term, short-lived, especially methane is a short-lived pollutant, we don't have to deal with it in the future, right? What a win-win-win all around, right? Deal with it today, and then don't have any of the negative repercussions in the future. And
I think to that point, the solutions are really simple. They are incredibly binary. It's not like we're having to invent a brand new source of energy. We're not having to, realize fusion and fission. We're not having to change our entire grid. These are really simple solutions. It's things like feeding cows differently. It's things like plugging oil and gas leaks. It's things like taking excess waste gas that comes from landfills and harnessing it and leveraging it as an input to our grid system. Like, these are opportunities to absorb a huge amount of accretive capital from a business perspective. Methane is valuable. It is an incredibly energy-dense molecule, and by allowing it to escape into the atmosphere, we're basically throwing money into the wind. And so capturing this methane that would otherwise go into the atmosphere and utilizing it as the amazing energy source that it is not just great for our energy security, but it's also amazing for potential future profits.
So your background was part policy, part environmental science. You were very busy in all of your school as well as your career, and I love the bringing together the policy and the science. And I'm sure that space, when we think about methane in particular, is broad and deep, and I'd love to hear a little bit more about, as you, with your overview capital hat on, how are you balancing policy needs as well as the science and the investment portfolio also?
The policy needs are incredibly important, especially now, because that will dictate, as I mentioned, a lot of the market creation that needs to happen. So if we do things like regulate methane emissions from the oil and gas industry, there is more of an imperative to invest in methane detection technologies like MRV, so handheld laser devices that quantify methane emissions, or satellites or drones. So that's incredibly exciting. You know, there's just a huge need for, as I mentioned, just so many more people across the regulatory space, across the scientific space. And I think it is an incredibly nascent space, but 5 years ago, methane wasn't on the global climate agenda. And so you have amazing organizations like the Environmental Defense Fund, like your amazing organization, like Spark Climate Solutions, that are pushing this conversation forward. And, you know, a great shout out to the Environmental Defense Fund. They are at the forefront of not just the regulatory you know, aspect of methane, but they're also putting a stake in the ground in terms of, they just launched MethaneSat, which is a satellite that is actually orbiting the Earth and detecting in real time these methane emissions. And then they're taking that data where it can be usable by government agencies to create new regulations and frameworks and baselines for these emissions. So it really is an all hands on deck effort, and you need the science, you need the not-for-profit energy, you need the regulation, and you need the capital, because none of this can happen without the capital. But the funny thing is for the impact that methane has versus the capital that you actually need to put in to mitigate it, it basically is free. We just need the willingness to do it, and the best day to do it was yesterday, and the second best is today. The worst is tomorrow.
When you're looking at the landscape of different technologies and innovations in the methane emission reduction space, what kind of trends are you seeing? What are you getting really excited about as some solutions that can really make a difference, hopefully, you know, today and tomorrow?
It's a great question. So I mentioned two emitting sectors, agriculture and oil and gas, but there are others which are lesser known. So landfills are a huge source of methane emissions and a huge opportunity for recovering those emissions for energy. But also rice farming is around 10 to 14% of anthropogenic methane emissions. And how that happens is you have basically flooded rice paddies that create an oxygen-free environment where these methane, you know, creating systems can thrive. And so there are really interesting technologies that are leveraging publicly available and private satellite and monitoring data to understand how farmers in rural places like India, Southeast Asia are farming, and helping to provide pathways to changing farming practices to significantly reduce methane emissions. We've invested in a great company there called MITI Labs. We are still looking for opportunities in the waste space. It's a huge, huge opportunity, a little bit more complex and less binary than some of the other sectors that I mentioned, because you can capture gas, but there's also the entire value chain that leads up to waste. So how do we reduce waste both as individuals and on the municipal level? How do we sort our waste better? And then you have the oil and gas industry, which it is so simple. It's literally detect, quantify, and mitigate your leaks, and then you can keep your product in the pipe. You know, estimated leak rates for the oil and gas industry have been historically around 1 to 4%, which is still a lot of methane leaked into the atmosphere, but new data from these actual measurements are showing that these leak rates can be up to 10 to 14%. Wow. A huge amount of methane going into the atmosphere. So that's a great opportunity and a great financial opportunity. And then with cows, why there is this economic imperative to reduce methane is cows is the largest emitting source of anthropogenic methane. They create methane through the way that they break down their food in the rumen, which is like the chambers of the cow's gut, effectively. And by reducing or suppressing methane creation in these animals, you actually help to make them more efficient. So you can see up to 30% efficiency gains, which means these cows are getting fatter, faster on less food, saving farmers a huge amount of money in a very, very margin-constrained sector. So that's incredibly exciting. It's not just a climactic driver, or like a goodwill real change to make, you can see real financial benefit from investing in these methane mitigation solutions. So it's completely different from carbon dioxide, which we've just not been able to make work because carbon has very little value, except for its value in driving negative consequences for climate change.
I love the flip of like, how do you make methane, how do you extract the value of methane, right? And flipping the script a little bit there. Thanks for bringing that to us, Lauren. So we have lots of folks who are interested in investing, hopefully everyone now, in methane, because we've convinced them that methane is a critical component that we need to be thinking about when we talk about climate change. What message do you have for other investors in particular who might be hesitant to invest in methane reduction strategies?
I think every investor that's focusing on climate should have a vertical focused on methane and super pollutants. We are unique in the fact that we are indexing on technologies, so we have many technologies in the enteric space, many in the oil and gas space, and we're investing at the earliest stages. So if you are a later stage investor, looking towards a fund like ours or other funds that are really diving in deep to these sectors, really understand all of the players and have very scientific reasons for why one will likely succeed over another. Partnering with a firm like ours is a really great place to start, but one of the things that investors love is being early to an opportunity. And so if you like money and you like future returns and you also like positive impact, I would suggest taking a peek at methane.
Okay, if you like money, if you like positive returns, if you want to help stop climate change, look at methane. I love that. So really grounding in the science, grounding in methane as being a critical solution in the climate space, and flowing capital at all different stages.
That's right.
Those are some of the things that I am so excited that you shared with the audience today. Just to get personal for a moment.
Yes, please.
What drives you? Like, why, when you wake up in the morning, what is getting you super jazzed to work on methane investments?
I think that my only role in life has been and is to create large-scale positive environmental change. That is the only thing I care about, that and my dog Rose. And
your dog Rose. Love it, yeah, right.
And when you look at what actually moves the needle on climate change, it is methane. And to see something so underappreciated that could be so impactful, it's basically like you see someone drowning and you keep walking. Like, methane is the best way that we can address current warming, and we're not doing anything about it. I do feel, as someone who has a background in science and in policy and is now deploying capital but has raised quite a lot of capital for my personal businesses, that it is my job and my responsibility to help to raise awareness about this and help to empower people that are much more competent than me, that are building solutions to solve this problem.
Thanks so much, Lauren. And I think another theme that I'm taking away from this is just collaboration, right? To find the folks who, like the methane intensive that you led, right? 200 people in a room talking about methane. That is a powerful place to continue and grow a conversation about climate change solutions.
Yeah, we got into this problem together and we have to get out of it together. But what's really exciting is that it's just a few sectors and a few industries and a few decision makers that are the ones that can make the difference. And so if we really put our collective energy towards approaching them and giving them solutions and capitalizing those solutions, then we can do this very, very quickly. There is so much hope and so much positive energy and positive tailwinds towards methane mitigation. We just have to do it today, right now. Go. No.
That is your marching orders today are to talk about methane, to learn about the science, to learn about the pathways for investing and funding in methane, and work together. We're in this together. Lauren, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
It's been such a pleasure.
Yes. Thank you.